It is a stereotype. I've been told countless times that Americans are ignorant of the world and their place in it. But is it really that bad? Are Americans really ignorant enough to warrant a world-known stereotype? The short answer is yes, we are. Hi, my name is Emma. I'm a U.S. American. I was born in the U.S., raised by parents who never left the U.S., and educated in a U.S. school system. I have spent the last 3 years attending university in the United Arab Emirates, which means I have spent the last 3 years fielding questions back home about what it's like to live in Saudi Arabia. I love my country, but I can confidently say that we don't know what we don't know. But you shouldn't take my word for it. Facts are important, so we're going to go over some fun statistics. In 2016, National Geographic and Council on Foreign Relations conducted a global literacy survey of young adults who had been educated in American colleges and universities. They found that a majority of them could only locate one of these 4 Middle Eastern countries, and it happens to be the biggest one. In that same survey, they also asked questions about geography, current world events, foreign affairs, and government, and they found that the overall average score was 55%. In that same survey, they also asked respondents to list how important they thought these topics were for them to know about. Current world events ranked first, and the majority of respondents thought that every single topic was at least very important for them to know about. So we want to know about these things, but the knowledge simply isn't there. It's not a lack of caring, it's a lack of knowing. There's a disconnect between what we think is important for us to know and what we actually know. But also saying, I'm not giving this TED Talk from some high horse, thinking I am so much more knowledgeable than all my American counterparts, and all inferior Americans should just be better, like me. That is not the case. Before starting at NYU Abu Dhabi, I didn't know where Abu Dhabi was because I didn't know where the UAE was because I didn't know where the Gulf was. I didn't know that India had multiple languages, and I didn't know they'd been colonized by the British. I didn't know what countries made up the EU, or what the EU was even for. When my freshman year roommate told me she was from Trinidad, I had never heard the word Trinidad before. For weeks, people would introduce themselves to me and tell me where they were from. And I would smile, and I would nod, and I would immediately Google map the country they had told me they were from as soon as they left. For months, I thought I was just dumb. A lot of you hearing this are probably thinking the same thing. I thought that my test scores were a sham, as well as my admission to this university. But ignorance doesn't have a lot to do with intelligence. Americans aren't just dumb, we aren't just stupid, we're ignorant. We don't know what we don't know. So why? Turns out the fault doesn't lie entirely on the individual. There are a lot of factors at play that work against us. One of them is geography. The US is very large, like really big. This is one of our 50 states. The US is also very isolated. So Americans read news, but news online tends to be regionally focused. So Americans read news about the US. The second is public education. Only 10 states require that geography be taught in high schools. And in 2010, the National Assessment of Educational Progress found that less than 30% of 12th graders were proficient at geography. So these are topics we aren't even teaching young people in our country. The third is media. We all have heard about the lack of diversity in Hollywood, and it's true. They tell us the same stories. but all of media sells America to Americans. They change for us. Time magazine often changes its covers for the US and the rest of the world. So, when I say that we exist in a bubble, I mean it. We have very few outlets that burst that bubble. Unfortunately, our ignorance does not affect only us. If Americans stay ignorant, we will make uneducated voting decisions on foreign policies that could negatively affect people in countries we can't even locate on a map. It is not just our problem, because it doesn't just affect us. So how can we fix this? Instead of just telling Americans to be better, how can we actually fix this? Traveling. That's not really going to help. Travel is often the go-to solution, especially in recent years. People are really concerned with the fact that Americans don't travel. But saying that traveling is what's necessary in order to be a knowledgeable global citizen is not only a privileged solution, it's just not a solution. This next point can be applied to people from anywhere. Ignorance at home is ignorance abroad. So, if the only website you visited prior to your trip was TripAdvisor, you're not going to come home having magically learned vast amounts of information about the history and culture of the place you went to. Travel is not a replacement for education, but people are starting to treat it like it is. International travel gives us a complex. We collect passport stamps like they're the currency that proves we're cultured, and those stamps become substitutes for actually gaining knowledge about a place. That's why a girl I know went to India for 3 weeks, came home, and got a tattoo in the wrong language. Because ignorance at home is ignorance abroad. So how can we fix this? If we can't just jump on a plane, how can we fix this? America needs a lot of help. We need to revamp our media outlets, and we need to make sure we are teaching these topics to young people in our country. And I need to at least graduate first before I can fix all of that. And a lot of people in this audience aren't even from the US. But this problem, ignorance, although pervasive in the American context, is not exclusive to the US. Every individual battles with ignorance. So how do we fight it? I will never forget the moment, my freshman year, when a boy who had grown up here noticed my ignorance. It had presented itself as culture shock plastered on my face. He pulled me aside and he pointed it out. I was mortified that he had called my bluff. But he asked me if I wanted to talk about it. He asked me what my questions were. He asked me what it was I didn't know. And I learned so much that day. I think we need to stop this forced politeness that prevents us from learning and educating. I should not have smiled and nodded when someone mentioned a country I didn't know. But I did. I didn't ask a question because I was embarrassed, and I was worried I was going to offend them. Looking back, I wish they asked me a question. I wish they had asked me this: what do you know about my country? This is a very international audience, so for a lot of you, the issue of American ignorance is not your fight, and it isn't your responsibility to fix it. It's mine. But we shouldn't have to accommodate the ignorance we encounter. We should be allowed to ask this question, not to shame or embarrass someone. but to start a dialogue. It will allow us to educate and learn. I would have been terrified if somebody asked me this question back then. And even today, it would still make me uncomfortable because it forces me to admit what I don't know. It forces me to acknowledge my own ignorance. Don't let the fact I'm up here, by the way, convince you I'm no longer ignorant. There's still an embarrassingly vast amount of information I don't know. But I'm getting better at admitting that because I realized it's the only way to learn. Oftentimes, ignorance is in plain sight, and yet we refuse to expose it in ourselves or challenge it in others. And we should. It's important that we do. At the end of the day, it's quite simple. If there is something you don't know, ask. It's important that you ask. And if you meet someone who doesn't know something that's really important to you, you're allowed to tell them about it, even if it makes them slightly uncomfortable. Because if we are never challenged, we will never get any better. Thank you.